Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is a pleasure to introduce our guest today, a friend and fellow futurist, and someone who I deeply respect, having read a number of his books, have benefited from his research, from his insights, from his messages. I must say, without any sort of sense of exaggeration, that I believe he is one of the top thinkers about the global issues that we confront at this most opportunistic yet perilous time in our world history. And he's the author of Hello Future, The World in 2035. Welcome, Langdon Morris.
Oh, Robert, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And you also didn't mention that we've had a lot of great conversations over the years, which I have really appreciated and learned a lot from. So I'm looking forward to having another great conversation with you today.
You betcha. Let me just mention a few of your credentials to those who will be tuning in and will not necessarily know what a future is. In fact, that's going to be my first question to you, Langdon. But let me just give the viewers a little bit of a background here. You're one of the top thinkers and consultants and authors, the author of 15 books on innovation, on the future, on foresight, and other things. But you're also a public speaker and a facilitator of events where people can, in effect, as I always say, play with the clay in terms of getting their arms around the future. So rather than just sitting there in the seats, absorbing the great ideas of this speaker up on the stage, you get them going. And I want to hear more about how you do that, what you do, and so forth. Among his clients are NASA, MasterCard, UNICEF, Total, the energy company based in France, and many, many other of the top 1,000 global corporations and NGOs. He is also a former senior practice scholar at the Acuff Center of the University of Pennsylvania. He's taught MBA courses in innovation and strategy at École Nationale, University of Belgrano in Argentina, and many, many other important assignments and engagements and guest lectures at very prominent universities. So we're so happy to have you on. And what I'd like to do is just get right into the substance of this. Langdon, how do you define futurist? How do you define what you do for clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a very timely one, obviously, given how fast the world is changing and what we're coping with globally. So the way I think about it is a futurist is someone who's really paying attention to the future, really makes it a subject of serious study, research, etc. But it's not enough to just gather data. What a professional futurist does is they create a framework or a model that explains the patterns of change. Because we immediately have to make a distinction between all these events that are happening, which creates a very, very chaotic environment for all of us, and the underlying patterns and driving forces, which is where we can really apply our skills and knowledge. So, we don't know who's going to win next weekend's football games. We don't know who's going to win the election. Obviously, that's coming up, and that's pretty significant. We don't know what's going to happen worldwide in Ukraine or in the Middle East or anywhere else. We can't predict that. But if we understand the patterns and the driving forces that are making history evolve, then we can prepare ourselves because we know then what we need to focus on. So a futurist is someone who is studying all this stuff, understands the patterns and the driving forces, and then it's prepared to gather new information that says, wait a minute, I had a model of what's happening, but I have this new data point that says, well, maybe my model is wrong. And so we have to continually adapt and adjust our thinking because things are changing so fast.
Well, that's exactly right. I sometimes am asked, what is a futurist, by the by your seatmate on the airplane when you introduce yourself or
Yeah.
whomever.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that. I always try to think about it in terms of what we do for our clients.
Mhm.
And you just explained it beautifully, because if you can see the pattern, I think all great investors are tuned into these patterns. I think all great CEOs, in effect, and visionary entrepreneurs and innovators, they may not have the tools that you and I have, but they're intuitively tuned into these patterns, and they use those patterns. They ride that sort of wave, if you will.
Let me just add one thing on that,
Yeah,
because I think that's a really interesting point that you make. So, identify an investor or an entrepreneur that really just absolutely nailed it and came up with exactly the right business model that no one else saw.
Hmm.
The challenge that they face, in my experience, is that the world is going to continue to change, and whatever was exactly the perfect business model now, in 2 or 5 or 10 years, won't be anymore. And the greatest business leaders and entrepreneurs recognize those changes, and they can then adapt their business model to the new conditions.
right.
And the ones who are not great can create something amazing, but then it hits the peak and it goes down because the world continues to change, and they're still living in that prior model or that prior framework. So
Yeah.
again, where the value that someone like you or I can add is that we can help them recognize when the party's over and when you got to come up with a new thing. It may have been brilliant 5 years ago, and if it doesn't change and adapt, we've got IBM as a sort of a classic example. Leading American computer company for decades, hundreds of thousands of patents, the best technology, blah 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 blah, and now they're completely irrelevant because they did not recognize how change was going to affect their industry. So they became a follower instead of a leader, and fell way far down on the list. We don't talk about them when we talk about Apple and Amazon and Google, because they're irrelevant, and they're irrelevant because, in a sense, you could say from our perspective, they weren't very good at futurism.
Right. Well, that's a very good point. So, how do you spot the signals, and how do you separate them from the noise? There's so much noise in the environment. Let's assume or pretend that I'm one of your client busy executives. Give me personal coaching here. How do I tune in to the signals and hear them?
So again, it goes back to the patterns and the driving forces of change. So every industry, every company there are certain patterns that are really relevant to them. And a pattern that's relevant to everybody today is technology and how it's unfolding. Particularly things like artificial intelligence or quantum computing. And so we have to pinpoint, what these forces are, what the technologies are, what the social trends are, what the demographic trends are, what the consumer market trends are. And we have to understand sort of, where it's been, where it is, and that enables us to think about where it might be going.
Right.
And where it might be going then becomes a hypothesis. And we don't want to turn that into a prediction. We don't want to say, okay, well, we know that in 2 or 3 or 5 years it's going to be X, because that's probably erroneous thinking.
Right.
But we think it might be X, or it might be Y, or it might be Z. So if it turns out to be X, we need to prepare for this. If it turns out to be Y, we need to prepare for that. If it turns out to be Z, we need to prepare for that or something else. So we get our mind adjusted to 2 things. Number one, everything's going to change, so we have to be ready for that. Number 2, we're not going to try to predict, so we're going to think about a range of possibilities, and then we're going to be mentally prepared for that. And as events unfold, then we start to channel our investments accordingly. And some of our investments are pretty short term, some of them are longer lead time. So we're back to our innovation management practices of innovation portfolios.
Right.
Is a critical tool for this. The way you adapt to change is you create an innovation portfolio, and that portfolio has, a variety of bets of very low risk, very high risk, and a variety of sort of future orientations. And that some of those bets are never going to pay off. And so you're thinking like a venture capital investor, where, a typical VC portfolio might have 10 or 20 companies, and out of those, they expect that half of them will fail. The problem is at the front end, they don't know which half. So they place 20 bets. They expect 10 of them to fail, and they think that the 3 that succeed spectacularly are going to carry the day. Now, that's a very successful model that venture capitalists have been using, since the 1960s worldwide. And so we want to adapt that kind of thinking to our business strategy, to our business model, and to how we prepare for the future. So again, going back to the beginning of my point and sort of the core of the question, we got to figure out what the driving forces and patterns are that are pertinent to the industry, create a model of where that might go, start tracking that, and start defining what investments would enable us to either protect ourselves from a defensive point of view, or to take advantage of emerging trends and possibilities in, again, in technology and society and culture and the marketplace, et cetera. And so, that's the kind of thinking that we help our clients do. Right. Earlier, you mentioned that a big part of this is not just standing in front of the room and trying to be smart. It's getting a group of people to think about these questions themselves. Because it's one thing to hear someone like Robert Tucker stand up and say, here's what's going to happen. It's very different if a team of executives gets together and says, okay, well, here's what I know. And then my colleague says, here's what I know. And then my other colleague says, here's what I know. And we try to fit all that together. Right. Then we are, as a team, much more prepared because we've shared perspectives and we begin to have a shared understanding, which enables us to move much more quickly when it comes to investment and action. So that's my not short answer to your question.
Well, no, it's great. And I think one of the things you and I have in common is that we're not only futurists, but we're also innovation consultants or
exactly.
And that sort of thing. So take us into the room where you're helping a company or a client to, as you say, prioritize or get a sense of what their driving forces are, because they will be different. If I'm MasterCard, they'll be different if I'm Boeing. Right.
Absolutely.
So how do you get them to do that? Do you break them up into small groups at table? Yep. Do you have certain tricks up your sleeves, or how do you actually accomplish that? And how long should we expect that to take?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the technique that we have found to be most effective is scenario planning, which is a technique that was developed in the 1960s at Shell Oil in Europe, which is a way of looking at the future without trying to predict what's going to happen. And you mentioned the Hello Future book. I used scenario planning in the writing of the book, and then I talk about the scenarios in the book itself. So I look at 32 different sort of alternative possibilities for the future and across a wide variety of themes. And that's exactly what we do with our clients. So the one I want to tell you about is some work we did with Total Energies, the French oil company's top 10, $200+ billion annual revenue. And we got hired by their corporate university to work with their senior executives in an annual course that they offered to their top people. And so our part of it was about innovation strategy and futurism. It was a week-long course, and we had a couple of days in that to work with them, typically about 50 people each year. And so we ran them through the process of doing scenario planning. So it wasn't me telling them about the future of the energy industry. It was them telling each other about their perspectives on the future of the energy industry, but in a very, very structured way. So it wasn't just a matter of, people making stuff up off of the top of their head. We really gave it a lot of structure, which enabled them to be quite rigorous in their thinking. Mm-hmm. We gave them a lot of background material to work through and asked them to identify the trends and patterns again. And then they themselves chose, what the themes were, what the driving forces were. So to your point, 50 people in the room, we would have had probably 7 teams of 7. Each team would have identified some of the driving forces that they thought were particularly relevant. And so they would work through a thought experiment, essentially, to think about, what would happen if this set of conditions emerged? What would happen if a different set of conditions emerged? So it's great training for the brain because it gets you out of this deterministic thinking, out of prediction mindset, and into a possibility mindset. And when you get in a possibility mindset, it completely changes how you think about what you need to do as a business leader. So this process was so successful that we ran it for them for 8 consecutive years. And I think we ended up with close to 1,000 of their senior executives in the course. And what then happened, and this was told to us sort of quietly off to the side, was that the people that we were working with were one level below the top. So there were 200 people that ran the corporation, and then about 2,000 people that worked at the next level. And the next level would be somebody, for example, who was running a refinery, an oil refinery in Africa. And it was a $2 billion refinery. So these guys were in charge of very, very large businesses, although they were not the top of Total. But they would then go back to the senior managers and share some of what they had learned in this process. And so senior management then started to do its own scenario planning. And it started to have a noticeable impact on the corporate strategy and corporate investment. So Total was one of the earliest of the big major oil companies in investing in alternative energy. They now have a very large energy portfolio in sustainability. And they have a corporate strategy that says that over the coming decades, they're going to transition from being an oil company to being an energy company, which is not an oil company, which is why they changed the name of the company from Total, which is what it was before, to Total Energies, which is what it is now, because the energies means sustainable energy is not just fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So giant corporation, we lead people through a learning process. That's what futurism is. Essentially, it's a learning process. It changes their perspective on how the future is going to be, and therefore changes their notions of how they want to invest, how they want to manage risk, how they're going to, do strategy, where they're going to look for opportunities, acquisitions, et cetera, et cetera. So I like that story, because it lasted a long time. We did it for 8 years. So, we were able to see the impact. And obviously we were able to learn from the experience and improve how we were leading these workshops. But it did, to all accounts, have an impact on the corporate strategy. And we can see that today in the performance of the corporation.
Fascinating story, and I appreciate you sharing that. And now we have the introduction of AI, which is really putting change on a new set of steroids. It's as if, the future is arriving faster and faster and faster. And there does seem to be, as optimistic as you are in this book, or realistic, I think you would probably say, but there does seem to be an uptick in anxiety, alienation, loneliness, those sorts of things, which are not bottom line necessarily for a corporate environment, but you and I are not only thinkers about how to help this company to inherit a better future, or to create a better future, perhaps. We are also concerned because we look at trends across the board, regulatory trends, social, geopolitical, demographic, so forth. We are concerned about humanity. I mean, there's a book out there right now on the bestseller list by Ray Kurzweil called The Singularity is Nearer. And it is a prediction that within the next 10 years, machines will become smarter than people. Pretty bold prediction. Some would say it's already occurring. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. The difference between predicting and forecasting. Should we as futurists refrain from predicting, or should we not?
I think you mentioning Kurzweil is a good way to start that conversation. So it's a great book. I'm enjoying it myself. It's a sequel to a book that he wrote 20 years ago called The Singularity is Near. So it went from near to nearer. And one of the things he does in the book very openly is he said, I wrote this book 20 years ago, or whenever it was, the original book. And now I want to update it. So in the original book, he made a series of predictions. And in the new book, he's saying, okay, so how are my predictions? And he's giving himself pretty high marks, I think justifiably, because his predictions were very good. And so the question for us becomes, well, how come he got it so right? What was he doing? And what he was doing was he was tracking the driving forces and the underlying patterns. So the current book and the previous book, which I also had read and really, really enjoyed, got a lot of value from it. uses a lot of statistics that he graphs over short period or long periods of time that enable him and us as his readers to discern the patterns. So he's making a prediction, but not because he's, putting his finger in the air and seeing which way the wind is going. He's making a prediction because he has looked really long and hard at the data. There's 100 pages of footnotes and data so in the book itself. So, you pick up the book and it's this big, and then you discover, oh, well, this much of it is the back end material. So, he's very rigorous about that. And in that situation, in my mind, the predictions that he's making are fully justified. And then on top of that, he made them 20 years ago. And we're tracking right along with what he said 20 years ago. So he's just updating us to say, hey, guys, I was right. So looks like where we're headed. And it really looks like this is where we're headed. And it's a really important topic for all of us because it's about AI and computer technology becoming, quote, smarter than humans, although that's a tough thing to say because that has so many nuanced meanings, but certainly capable of doing things that humans can't do intellectually. Mm-hmm. And we're already seeing that with AI. So it's not like he's predicting something that's right in the future. In the last 2-3 years, AI systems have been used to solve problems that humans had not been able to solve. Look at, huge big data sets and identify patterns that people couldn't come up with. And this is being applied in many, many scientific domains. So if you're going to be in the prediction business, I would say do it that way. Do it with that kind of rigor, with that kind of determination to be intellectually honest and to dig into the facts and then come up with your models and then put those models out. To an extent, I do that in this new book, Hello Future, not as narrowly as Kurzweil, who is focused really on AI and computer technology per se. But, the questions that I'm trying to get to are, what's going to happen from a broader perspective in a number of different fields, geopolitics, politics, the economy, demographics, et cetera. Because again, if we can find those patterns, then we know a lot about what's going to happen.
Right. I think machines will become, quote unquote, smarter than humans in so many different ways, but in certain ways, they will be as dumb as ever. They will be still dumb, okay, no matter when we're talking. And that comes back to your whole notion of patterns and using history to guide us into the future. And I think, some of the things that young people have to contend with today, for example, the onslaught of TikTok and the fracking of information,
we got to be clear thinkers or we're really going to be lost. And if we delegate clear thinking and judgment and decision making to technology, we're most likely not going to be happy with how that turns out. So technology in the form of advanced AI and the things that Kurzweil is talking about will definitely have amazing capabilities, but it's not to replace human judgment, ethics, morals, or commitment to one another and making the world better for all of us, to your point.
Well, that's why I want to talk just a little bit as we close here more about the book, because I just want to acknowledge all the hard work. I mean, you are such a great boiler downer, so to speak, of someone's argument or of an incident that might happen or a quip or a quote from the past, from a futurist to someone who lived long ago or someone who lives now. So tell me this, as we close here, how would you summarize the message of Hello Future, the world of 2035, from the standpoint of something that is a theme through this book, is that we can shape the future? Tell me about what you meant by that.
Well, first of all, thank you for all those nice things you said about the book. I hope that whoever is listening to this hears that and says, oh, I got to buy that book.
You better believe it. Yeah, that's why we write books, to be read.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it. So it was interesting for me. The choice to write the book came out of the work I did for Total, as well as a number of other clients, some of the ones you mentioned earlier. because when you do that kind of work, again, as a facilitator, you're just absorbing a huge amount of information. And so my head gets full of stuff, and then I start to wonder, how does all this make sense? What's the pattern? And so most of the books that I've written, I started because I had the germ of an idea in my head, or a question or a problem, and I wanted to resolve it. And I enjoy writing. So writing is just a way for me to try to make sense out of something, to give it enough structure so that I feel like I understand it. So that's how this book got started. I had all that stuff in my head, and I was wondering, like, where are we headed here? What's going on with society, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we all have impressions and ideas. We see the news, we read the news, whatever form it comes to us, and we realize that there's an awful lot going on. And so, I wanted to try to make sense of what's all this stuff that's going on. And so, as I started writing, what I discovered was actually the first part of the book was simply talking about what it means to be a futurist, and what does a futurist think about, and how does a futurist think. Initially, I wasn't going to put that at the beginning, but then I realized that sort of sets the context for the content that follows. So it's only 50 or 60 pages, but I think it's really helpful. The bulk of the book is looking at what I decided in my own mind were the 8 critical driving forces that are shaping the world today. Those 8 being geopolitics, politics, climate change, the energy transition, technology, obviously including AI, demographics, the economy, and culture. So based on everything I had assembled in my own mind as I was working it out, those were the 8 critical things, the driving forces that are shaping the future. And what I wanted to do then is understand, what are the patterns associated with each of those, and how might that unfold? Again, I was avoiding the prediction trap of trying to say this is where it's going, but I wanted to frame the question, where might it go? So for each of the 8 themes, there's a pretty long chapter of just exploring the sort of the topics and subtopics. And then I get into, okay, so with respect to geopolitics, when you boil it all down, what's the choice in geopolitics? Well, it's either war or peace. So if there's war, what's it going to look like? If there's peace, what's that going to look like, et cetera? So I do that. So I apply this. It's essentially a simplified version of scenario planning. I apply that to all 8 themes. I ended up with 32 of these pairs of options, like A or B, et cetera. So 32 thought experiments, so to speak. And then I thought I was done. I thought, okay, well, I've got it. And I realized that I wasn't done at all because of the point that you just made, which is that in each of these areas, we as a community, we as a nation, we as a global society are going to be making choices, whether it's a choice in election, or a choice of a government program, or a choice in a corporation, or a choice in your family, or a choice for you personally. We're making choices. And so we have the choice to choose what sort of future we want to create, which again, this election has, the subtext of this election is very much about that, although it's not spoken about very much explicitly. And so I wrote the third part of the book about, choosing. So how do we choose? What should we choose? How should we think about the choices that we have? And what opportunity do we have to create a future world that we would prefer to live in versus having a future world that we would not prefer to live in? And what I realized through all of that is that, and this is, I think that the driving underlying theme of the entire book is that we are right now in this decade, from now until 2035, in a period of transformation, or a period of transition, whichever word you want to use. So the world of 2035 is going to be fundamentally different from the world of today, because in each of those 8 things that I just listed, we are undergoing fundamental change. And we're undergoing fundamental change in a way that we are not going back. And so when you put all that together, we get A, future shock because it's overwhelming, but B, we get an opportunity to recreate society in a way. And this is an opportunity that only comes along very rarely. The last time it happened was between 1780 and 1820, when the Industrial Revolution started. That was a complete reformulation of global society, not because anyone planned it out, but because science and technology advanced and enabled this new society to come about. And now we're at the same point here, from 2020 to 2050, we are going to recreate global society. We don't know what society we're going to create any more than they knew in 1780 what the world would look like in 1850. But we have the opportunity to see more clearly into the future than they did. And so we have not only a great responsibility, but a great opportunity to make choices that will lead to a better world for our children, for our grandchildren, and for everybody essentially. And as I said, that wasn't what I expected this book to lead to, but it's what the data led me to. It's what the patterns and the things that I learned and understood led me to realize we are at this point of transformation. We have a lot of choices to make, and we can make great choices or we can make not great choices. And so that's where we're at. So that's my rant on the book. Thank you very much for asking. I really appreciate the question.
You bet. And thank you for being on the program. And again, the book is Hello Future, The World in 2035 by Langdon Morris. And I believe it's available, on Amazon?
Yeah.
All the
it's on Amazon worldwide, both an ebook and a print book.
All of the others. And I'm sure that we'll put up some information on how that everybody can get in touch with you should they desire. Again, so much appreciation for what you've accomplished in the book and the way you've articulated the stakes in terms of the future that we can shape if we so desire, and if we step forth and do our job so that other generations can have the same good life that we have had. So thank you again, Langdon, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Robert. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to our next one as well. Take care.